June 20th, 1944. High above the western Pacific, the sky shimmered under the blazing tropical sun. At nearly 20,000 feet, the engines of dozens of American fighters roared through thin air as the United States Navy launched one of the largest carrier-based air operations of the Second World War. Among those pilots was a young man who had barely left his teenage years behind, a 19-year-old naval aviator flying his very first major combat patrol. He had less than a year of flight training, less than 100 hours in his fighter, and on that day, fate placed him directly in the path of some of the most experienced enemy pilots still alive in the Pacific War. 7 veteran Japanese fighter aces, men who had survived the brutal air battles over China, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands. Pilots who had spent years mastering the deadly dance of aerial combat. Against them stood a rookie barely old enough to vote. So how did a 19-year-old pilot survive an encounter with 7 hardened enemy aces? And how did a single desperate maneuver turn certain death into one of the most remarkable aerial escapes of the war? To understand what happened in that lonely patch of sky, we must return to the summer of 1944, during one of the most decisive battles ever fought in the Pacific. By mid-1944, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. After 2 years of brutal island-hopping campaigns, American forces were advancing steadily toward Japan itself. The next objective was the Mariana Islands. Strategically located deep in the western Pacific, the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would provide the United States with airfields close enough for the new B-29 Super Fortress bombers to strike the Japanese home islands. Japan understood the stakes. Losing the Marianas would open the door to direct bombing of the homeland. So the Imperial Japanese Navy assembled nearly everything it had left for a decisive counterattack. This would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On one side stood the massive American carrier force of Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. 15 aircraft carriers, over 900 carrier aircraft. It was the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. On the other side was the remaining strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm. 3 fleet carriers, several light carriers, and hundreds of aircraft flown by a mix of seasoned veterans and increasingly inexperienced replacements. But among those pilots were still a handful of dangerous survivors, men who had accumulated dozens of aerial victories during the early years of the war. The skies above the Philippine Sea would soon become a proving ground between these two forces. And somewhere in that vast aerial battlefield was a young American pilot who had never fired his guns in combat. His name was Ensign Alexander Vratsiu, one of the youngest fighter pilots assigned to fly the F-6F Hellcat from the carrier USS Lexington, CV-16. The Hellcat itself had quickly become one of the most feared naval fighters of the war. Powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, the aircraft could reach speeds of nearly 380 miles per hour. It carried 650 caliber machine guns, and it was built like a flying tank. But even the best aircraft in the world could not compensate for inexperience, especially when facing enemy pilots who had spent years perfecting the art of aerial combat. And on the morning of June 20th, 1944, that was exactly the situation unfolding high above the Philippine Sea. At 8:09:30 hours, radar operators aboard the American carriers detected incoming Japanese aircraft formations approaching from the west. Dozens of contacts, then hundreds. The enemy strike force was on its way. Within minutes, alarms echoed across every carrier deck. Fighter pilots scrambled into their aircraft. Engines roared to life. One by one, the American fighters launched into the morning sky. Among them was 19-year-old Ensign Vratsiu. For him, this would be his first major interception mission. As his F-6F Hellcat climbed toward 18,000 feet, he could see dozens of other fighters forming up around him. The radio chatter was constant, pilots calling out headings, squadrons organizing into defensive patrols. Below them stretched the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. Above them, the unknown. By 10:30 hours, American radar confirmed the approaching enemy formation. Japanese aircraft were closing rapidly. Estimates suggested more than 70 incoming planes, bombers escorted by fighters. As the distance shrank, the tension inside every cockpit became almost unbearable. Sweat ran down the backs of pilots beneath their flight suits. Hands tightened around control sticks. Eyes scanned the horizon. Then someone shouted over the radio, "Bandits, 12 o'clock high!" Dark specks appeared against the sky, growing larger with every passing second. The Japanese formation was led by Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, the legendary aircraft that had once dominated the skies early in the war. Behind them flew dive bombers and torpedo planes headed for the American fleet. The sky exploded into chaos. Hellcats dove into the enemy formation, guns blazing. Zeros twisted and rolled to meet them. Within seconds, dozens of aircraft were locked in violent aerial combat. Vrasiu followed his squadron leader into the fight. He saw tracer fire streaking past his canopy. Aircraft spinning downward, trailing smoke. Engines roaring. Machine guns hammering. Training took over. He maneuvered behind a Japanese bomber and fired a short burst. The guns rattled violently. Tracer rounds streaked forward. The bomber erupted in flames and plunged toward the ocean. It was his first victory, but he had no time to celebrate. Because in the next moment, the situation changed dramatically. As Vrasiu pulled out of his attack, he suddenly realized something terrifying. He had become separated from the rest of his squadron, and 7 enemy fighters were closing in behind him. The 7 aircraft approaching from behind were A6M Zeros, but these were not inexperienced rookies. The way they moved revealed something far more dangerous. Their formations were tight, their attacks coordinated. These were veteran pilots. They began climbing toward him in a classic interception pattern. Vrasiu pushed his Hellcat into a steep turn. The powerful engine roared as the aircraft accelerated, but the Zeros were lighter and more maneuverable. Within seconds, the first enemy fighter opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked past his wings. Another Zero dove in from above. Then another. 7 enemy fighters now circled around the lone American aircraft. It was a textbook aerial trap. The Zeros began taking turns attacking. One dove from above. Another climbed from below. Machine gun fire hammered the sky around him. The Hellcat shuddered as rounds struck the fuselage. Vrasiu threw the aircraft into a violent roll. The horizon spun wildly around him. He pulled into a steep dive. The altimeter dropped rapidly. 18,000 feet, 16,000, 14,000. The Zeros followed. They were relentless. Another burst of tracer fire ripped past his canopy just yards away. Inside the cockpit, warning lights flickered. The aircraft had taken damage. Oil pressure was dropping. The engine began coughing. For a moment, it seemed inevitable. 7 veteran aces against one 19-year-old rookie. The odds were impossible. The Zeros tightened the circle around him. One of them slid directly into firing position behind the Hellcat. Another approached from above. A third moved in from the left. The trap was closing. In a matter of seconds, the young pilot would be destroyed, unless he did something no one expected. At 12,000 feet, with enemy fighters closing from every direction, Vrasiu made a decision that defied conventional combat tactics. Instead of continuing to evade, he did something entirely unexpected. He pulled the Hellcat into a vertical dive. The nose dropped sharply toward the ocean. The aircraft accelerated violently, 350 miles per hour, 380, 381. The wind screamed across the canopy. The Zeros followed, but they had not anticipated the maneuver. The Hellcat's heavier frame allowed it to dive faster than the lighter Japanese fighters. Within seconds, the distance between them began to widen. But Vrasiu wasn't finished. At just 3,000 feet above the ocean, he pulled the aircraft into an extreme climbing turn. The sudden maneuver forced the pursuing Zeros to overshoot. 2 enemy fighters streaked past him. For a split second, one Zero crossed directly in front of his guns. Vrasiu fired. A short burst. The Zero erupted in flames. Another enemy fighter attempted to climb after him, but the Hellcat's powerful engine allowed it to regain altitude faster than expected. The Japanese formation broke apart. The coordinated attack had been disrupted. Suddenly, the hunters had lost their advantage. The remaining Zeros hesitated, and that hesitation was everything. Because American fighters from another squadron were now approaching the area. The Japanese pilots realized the danger. One by one, they broke off the pursuit and disappeared toward the horizon. The young American pilot had survived. 7 enemy aces had failed to bring down a single rookie. When Vrasiu finally landed back aboard the USS Lexington, ground crews quickly surrounded the damaged Hellcat. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage. One round had passed just inches from the cockpit. Mechanics counted multiple hits across the aircraft's wings and engine cowling. The young pilot climbed out of the cockpit exhausted but alive. His squadron mates listened in stunned silence as he described the encounter. 7 Zeros. A desperate dive. A split-second shot that destroyed one of the attackers. and a miraculous escape. Later that day, American forces achieved a crushing victory in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The battle would later become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It marked the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation as a major threat. For his skill and bravery during the battle, Alexander Vraciu would go on to become one of the U.S. Navy's leading aces. Over the course of the war, he would be credited with 19 aerial victories. At just 22 years old, he became one of the youngest fighter aces in naval aviation history. His actions during the Philippine Sea demonstrated a simple truth repeated countless times during the Second World War. Sometimes survival came down to training, sometimes to skill, but sometimes it came down to a single moment of courage, when a pilot refused to surrender to impossible odds. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.